Okay, so here we go, right here. Three, two, and one. Welcome back, everyone, to another exciting episode of Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people, where we speak about critical issues in the blindness community and all other issues from across the universe and galaxy. Today, boy, we got a treat for you today. Jeremy Opperman has agreed to join us for a double header, 2 hour special today. This is really an honor and a really special thing. Hour number one. Hey, let's talk about history. So, Jeremy, welcome back to Aaron's Opinion. Dig into the conversation. So, what is a historical topic and your whole love for history and culture? Why don't you just dive into the history book wherever you want to? I will certainly engage you as you work through the historical topic. We'll talk about this for an hour. First hour, part one, history, go.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, it's good to be back. It's good to be back. Yeah, history, I don't know when it started. I think probably where it started was that I come from a family of storytellers. My father and mother were both great storytellers in the sense of engaging us as children with stories about their lives. Um, I'm a little older than you, and so that means that my parents were in quite an exciting time. My mother and father grew up in the 20s in South Africa and in Namibia, which wasn't called Namibia in those days. It was called Southwest Africa. My mother grew up there. My father grew up here in South Africa. And his father was born during what is known as the Anglo-Boer War. Um, and his mother, in fact, was born just before the Boer War and remembers her uncles going to war. And so we were brought up with very rich storytelling. My mother, for instance, grew up, her first 6, 7 years of her life were in what is now essentially a ghost town. And it's called Kolmanskop, which means Coleman. Coleman is a name. It's actually named after a man called Coleman. And Kop it means head, but it means a little hill. And for some reason, diamonds were discovered there, alluvial diamonds. And the Germans, who had a colonial conquest of Southwest Africa, um, discovered these diamonds, and of course they flocked in. And it was very much like one of the silver or gold rush towns in Nevada and California that you are so familiar with. And so it was for diamonds. And her father came to South Africa. He was in the First World War, fighting on the German side, survived, obviously. They came after the Weimar Republic in Germany collapsed, and he jumped on a ship to come to Southwest Africa where there was opportunity. So very pioneering type times. And so my mother, born in 1926, literally had her first 6 years until the town ran out of diamonds, literally. And so she remembers and brought us up with stories of diamond discovery and diamond finding and the characters that existed. And today, to this day, you can travel to what is now Namibia, and and you go to a town called Luderitz, and you take a right and you travel for 20 miles, and there you will discover this ghost town, which the dunes have now partially occupied. The dunes have quite literally begun to take over, or have in fact taken over several of the buildings. There have been attempts at reclamation and at holding the dunes back, but the building quality was so good that those buildings still 120 years after having been built are still perfectly in good order. So those are so I grew up with this kind of storytelling. And I must tell you another interesting thing was in those days in the 70s, there was you're familiar with the concept of comics. Now, I had low vision. So I was able, using a magnifying glass very often, to read the words. I had to use a magnifying glass, but I was very fond of a comic known as oh heavens, I've forgotten it. The illustrated classic comic. And so illustrated classic comic. And it was wonderful. There were comics, but they were all the classics you cared to name. and they were illustrated, very colorful, beautifully drawn pictures. And the text was at the bottom of each frame, I seem to recall. And with the magnifying glass, I could read that, or my brother would read them to me. But I remember the pictures. I could perceive the pictures. And so at a very early age, I mean, I was literally 5, 6, 7. I was beginning to have a working knowledge of many of the world's classics because of these wonderful illustrated comic books. Just as a segue, there is a very sad fact that intellectuals, academic education intellectuals, thought that these kind of comics were bad for children, and the assumption was that they wouldn't read if they were subjected to these comics. In my opinion, that is patent nonsense. And so they withdrew them. And to this day, you cannot find illustrated classic comics, I don't believe. And so, luckily, we had a whole bunch of them that my father had bought for my older brothers. And so first they read them to me. And so, I was read to or started reading classics. And so at a very young age, I had a working knowledge of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, and the Red Badge of Courage, and several other Mark Twains, and Helen Keller, and hundreds, of comics, and many of them were of actual historical facts and historical accounts. Many of them were historical novels, all of the Jules Verne. So before I was 10, I had a working knowledge of every single Jules Verne. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Journey to the Center of the Earth, Journey to the Moon, Michel Strogoff. And I have a very good memory, and I can still, to this day, remember and picture some of the pictures from those classic comics. And what they did was, it wasn't long before I wanted to read them because I realized that they were abridged. And it wasn't long, but by then I was older, 10, 12, 13 onwards, and started reading the originals, the unabridged. And so that nonsense about children not actually going to read when they subjected to a comic is so unfortunately destructive. I'd like to hang those guys up by their toes because I think they probably did more damage withdrawing those things. Anyway, so that was my introduction to reading. And I think my love of history comes from my love of reading. And I attribute my love of reading to those very comics. And so it wasn't long before I was reading books. Now, I could only read in what was called large print in those days. And the only time you could find large print books, you would go to your local library and you would pretty much have to read what they had on shelf. And so, you couldn't always read what you wanted to read. And so I found myself reading, or my reading list was quite eclectic. And so I was reading things that might have been too advanced for me, or it might have been perhaps not appropriate, not so much appropriate, but not necessarily what a youngster might want to read. But what it did was it gave me a love of reading. And I had a father my father was, apart from being a great storyteller, he was extremely well read. And so it seemed to me as a child that this man, there wasn't a book he hadn't read. And he had a real passion. He had a particular stance. He had read many, 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 many fictional books in his life. And then something happened that made him want to only read non-fiction. And so I was brought up with this man. I don't believe, and I'm not kidding, I do not believe I remember him reading a novel. But I do remember him reading non-fiction continuously, biographies, histories, geography accounts, we had a library of National Geographics, that sort of thing. Reader's Digest, abridged biographies, Reader's Digest, encyclopedias. So the house was filled with books. One useful thing I might say is that in South Africa, we didn't have television until 1976. And I suspect that might have had something to do with my love of reading, because we didn't have much else to do. I was 13 years old in 1976. By then, I was already reading prolifically. And history was a natural adjunct to that. It wasn't difficult to slip into an historical genre, if you like. Now, because of the age of my parents, um, my father grew up. We didn't have much experience of the Second World War in South Africa, other than, in other words, we were a combatant, but not in our country, much like America. You were a combatant, but not the war, other than in Pearl Harbor, didn't take place in America. And so South Africa was very similar to that. And so we had literally 500,000 soldiers fighting in the Desert War in the Eighth Army. And so my parents knew people. My father was too young to have been in the war. My mother was being a woman, wasn't she was older than my father by 3 years. So technically she could have been, had she been a man, she probably would have been. Um, but so but they knew people. And what was interesting is that they knew both sides. My mother was German. Although born in Namibia, she wasn't associated in any way with Nazi Germany. In fact, her father was very disillusioned when he heard what was going on. In fact, he naturalized to become a South African because he was appalled at what he read about Nazi Germany's growth between 1933 and the rest. And so they knew people. When, after the war, people came back from the war. I knew people who were damaged, people who were wounded. One of our best friends was a well-known blind veteran, which got me, I must tell you, into another very interesting angle. Was I became fascinated by war and by war history, largely because of meeting these people. I met a man, more than one, but one in particular, who at the end of the war was found by the Americans as a 13-year-old boy with a submachine gun on his arm and an enormous German helmet that swamped his head. He could barely see. And so, the whole concept of child soldiers, something we don't think about. And in 1945, in March, April 1945 in Berlin, which was an incredibly vicious campaign, there's this youngster. And I got to know him very well, his parents and he and his wife and his children. And I adored them. And he didn't have a vitriolic hatred of an enemy. He was very laconic about his experience. As you know, being I used to ask him what he felt, what he thought of fighting, and the only word he could really come up with was hungry. And so this fascinated me. And then I met this blind veteran. Jimmy Ellis was his name. And he was associated with a very well-known, still exists today, although the name has changed, a very well-known blind veterans organization called St. Dunstan's. And St. Dunstan's had started in 1918, in fact, in 1917 in England, and it was essentially a rehabilitation center for blind soldiers. And then by the Second World War, it was a very well-established organization. And of course, there was a brand new war and tons of people were blinded. It's actually quite interesting from a history point of view. It's quite interesting to see the difference because the nature of war changed. Sorry, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but it's quite an interesting segue, this. So in the First World War, in Britain alone, there were about 3,500 totally blinded veterans who came through the First World War. Many became blind later because of the gas. By the Second World War, there were only 1,800 blind United Kingdom veterans. Now, what that demonstrates is the change in war. First of all, no chemical warfare for a start. But it just shows you that as much of a vicious war, there were less blinded people. And I'll come back to that point because it's actually quite an interesting historical issue. So anyway, after the war, this man, Jimmy Ellis, who was a British man, blinded during the Desert War, the Britons sent all their damage, many of them, not just blind, but other wounded soldiers, to South Africa, because South Africa was a British dominion. And they sent them through the Suez Canal, down the east coast of Africa, and they disembarked at Durban, our easternmost city, or in Cape Town, which is where I live, which is the southernmost city and southwesternmost city. And both in Durban and in Cape, but in Cape Town, there was a rehabilitation center called Tembani. And this man, Jimmy Ellis, became one of their rehabilitation patients. But he was a very dynamic man, extremely funny. He could have been a stand-up comic. He had been a very useful boxer in his day. He had been a very good piano player, and he was seriously wounded. He had great. I couldn't see them, but he had terrible. What's that? Shrapnel scars on his face. And he had blown out both his eyes. He had picked up what you would now call an unidentified explosive device, an IED. He had picked up one of those and it blew up in his hand. And of course, it blew his hand off. So, as a young boy, you can imagine the macabre fascination of this very funny, very personable man with only one hand and a hook on the other and blind. And I grew up I grew up literally at this man's knee because he was one of our best friends. And so that gave me an interest and in military history. And years later, oh, and I must tell you that the reason why we got to know him was because my grandmother um, was by then running St. Dunstan's in South Africa. And she was the general manager of St. Dunstan's. And so we got to meet many blind veterans, not just blind from the Second World War, blind from the Korean War, we had a border war here for many years in the 70s and 80s, the border of Angola and Namibia. We fought a war, and many soldiers came back blind and wounded. And so we got to meet them because my grandmother ran this organization and she was a very social woman, and she encouraged these blind veterans to come to her home for drinks. And so I was very exposed to that. So that gave me quite an interest. And I must tell you, my grandmother died. She ran the place until 1985, retired, and she died 3 years later. So that was 1988. In 2003, St. Dunstan, South Africa, asked me, because by then I was quite a well-known blind entrepreneur, and I was a consultant, and I was well-known, and so I was asked to sit on the board of St. Dunstan's, and I still do. And so I got exposed to the modern St. Dunstan's, the border war blinded guys, some of the old Second World War guys, a few of them lived still, but then they all died. But then we had an interesting experience because there was a joint exercise, if you like, a collaborative association between the American Blind Veteran Association and in the UK, blind veterans used to be called St. Dunstan's. They now changed their name to Blind Veterans, and our St. Dunstan's. And we used to get together. And we got together in London, and we got together in South Africa. And I was privileged enough to fly up to the UK, and I met with the American blind veterans. And I met, obviously, with the UK, and we stayed at the incredibly elaborate blind rehabilitation center belonging to the United Kingdom Blind Veteran Association. And it was a great privilege. And this is where I told you I'd get back to something. And my interest in war history sparked something here. And I was curious that, remember I said the First World War, 3,500 were blinded, Second World War, 1,800. This is just in the UK soldiers. What was interesting was that both Britain and America have fought a 24-year war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, not quite 24 years because they've got out of Afghanistan now, largely, and Iraq. But the point is, at the time of asking, that war was about 15, 16, 17 years old. Much longer than either the First World War, in fact, longer than the First World War and the Second World War combined. And there were literally only a couple of hundred blind veterans. from those two wars, which is quite an interesting issue. Just think about it. And what it is, it's a commentary on the changing nature of war. Warfare is different now. There's a lot more distance warfare, drones, that sort of thing. Also, the advance of protective armor is something they never had in the First World War and the Second World War. The only armor you had on your person was a helmet, and that wasn't much use. Now there is incredible Kevlar armor that the soldiers wear. The helmets are much more elaborate. There's face guards. And so explosions which might have blinded people in the Second World War and First World War now don't actually blind soldiers as much because of their very sophisticated helmet gear and armor. And so soldiers are being blinded now less from blunt trauma or gross trauma, like an explosive thing or a sniper shot. That will still happen. But what they're being blinded from now is percussion injuries, which damage the brain, and particularly the part of the brain which governs the optic nerve. And so that's an interesting situation. Anyway, so back to this man that I met, and so it really spurred my interest to read. And so my first history book that I read about war was the story of Douglas Bader, who happened to be the double amputee war ace. He was a bit of an ace, although he was shot down quite early. In the Second World War, he was a British RAF pilot, and he was captured fairly early, but he was a useful pilot. And of course, the fact that he was a double amputee really sparked my interest. I wasn't particularly interested in disability in those days. I hadn't really made the connection between my blindness and other people's disabilities. I really hadn't thought that through. But obviously, this is something of a hero thing going on here with this man. And so his book was called, it wasn't written by him, it was written by a man called Paul Brickhill. And it's called A Reach for the Sky. And it was aimed at youngsters. It was aimed at teenagers. In fact, it was a set work book when I was at school. And so that was my first war history. And my second, interestingly, was a book about the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, two, I think. And it was written by the Japanese side. It was written by a Japanese captain of a ship at Midway. Sorry, I lied. The book was about Midway, not Pearl Harbor. But it obviously began with Pearl Harbor. But it was so interesting to read it from a Japanese perspective. And so I started getting quite interested in reflective history reading where you can see both sides. I don't do it all the time. And I haven't had the luxury of always finding, and this is the trouble with blind readers, is that we are very often, as I grew older and my vision grew less, I was less and less able to read what I wanted to read. I didn't do Braille because I hadn't gone to a school for the blind. So I was very much captured in what I read. I had to read what I found. And then I joined, South Africa has a very sophisticated tape aids for the blind library, which is also the Braille library. And it's very old, it's 100 years old. And so I joined Tape Aids for the Blind, and there I found a very rich source of material to read. So I was now in university, and I was able to read more. And but still, you can't always read what you want to read. You can only read what they have available. And now that's always frustrated me. To this day, it frustrates me. There are many things, particularly in history, which you can't find in an accessible format. And I find that very sad, actually. But it did start me on, so I was by now well entrenched. And so I didn't bother with novels as much. So I wasn't hooked on novels at all, really, because there was just so much really exciting. I mean, there's nothing more exciting than war history that's written well. That got me onto biographies because, you read a character, like Admiral Cunningham, who apparently, if you read about Admiral Cunningham, it was the admiral of the fleet during the Second World War for the British. I mean, his story reads like Nelson. In fact, he's regarded as a modern Nelson. Um, so I had read his biography, and you don't need to read fiction when you read a well-written biography or autobiography. There is so much out there which is captivating, and if you have a very vivid imagination like I did, probably helped by my parents' storytelling and my ability to have enjoyed those classic comics, these things come alive. So when I read a story, a biography, when Teddy Roosevelt was shot, I forget if it was 1912 or 1914, I forget, and he was campaigning. He wanted to be president again. He'd already had a term and a bit. He took over from McKinley when McKinley was dead, was assassinated in September 1901. And so Teddy, finished McKinley's term, and then went on for a second term. That's great. And then Taft joined, and then Taft came in, and then Teddy wanted to run again. And Teddy has the most extraordinary history. The what does he call himself? The wild, I forget the name. But he was quite wild, and he it was wonderful stuff what he had been through in Cuba, um, for instance. Um, and he was a tough guy, and he boxed, and he was a great hunter, and he was an incredibly thoughtful person. Actually, the reason why America has the number of game reserves and natural conservatories, reserves, is entirely 100% because of Teddy Roosevelt. And so his sort of biography reads like a novel. When he was shot, how incredibly, it was tragic, but he didn't die, and he relatively slightly, he was significantly wounded, and all this has come up for me when Trump the other day, had a near miss in that assassination attempt. I immediately thought of Teddy, because
Right, right.
Teddy
So
was also on it.
so Jeremy, just
Yeah,
want to step in here for a couple of things.
yeah.
Nothing personal about you. Just for my own sanity and personal security. Uh, please, I don't mean to sound harsh.
I know where you're
You
going. I'm not going to say anything about it.
please don't just for right now, things are a little tense in our country. Please don't mention President Trump at the moment, okay?
No,
Just
with
to be because
pleasure.
people are watching this and you don't want to say
Abs-
anything about that right now.
Okay,
But what
no
I
problem.
wanted to say, thank you. But what I wanted to say was your and I was waiting for a time to interject because I want to make sure that our audience, I want to make sure that our audience can ask you a history question because and then we'll talk for another half hour about history and then we'll transition because I know that they do. Latabo from South Africa and of course Preston have questions. But before I do open their microphones, your story just resonates so well with me. That this is exactly how I grew up, and in the states. And yes, we in high school we learn about the Boer Wars in Boer, the Dutch word for the Netherlands word for farmer in Dutch. Yes,
That's right.
the
That's
the,
right.
the War of the Farmers. Yes, we American people sort of know what you were talking about, but American people are only a little bit. We vaguely know about these things, but not nearly as much as you do, and you really know. So how many history classes do you teach in your local university? Because I think you're overly qualified.
Not one.
I gotta say.
Not
Um,
one. But
that's very funny. But the overarching thing that you said that really resonated with me is you developed an eclectic, which is how I am. I'm definitely eclectic, and you developed an eclectic interest in the military, and actually, so do I, and so did I. And
mm,
I think that a lot of blind people, although it pains me to tell you that even in America, I cannot be in the army, which has given me in my lifetime a great deal of confusion and sadness.
yeah.
But that's life. I actually think that a lot of blind people are fascinated by soldiers simply because of two main reasons. Soldiers come together, they accept each other, and they fight superhuman accomplishments. So I
Yes.
think that's very attractive to someone with a,
Mm, mm.
with a disability, which is why I always think it's strange how in America I can't be in the military, which I always think is strange because there are, and you can stretch your imagination to know what groups of people I'm talking about, but there are minorities who are minorities in America who can be in the army, and then blind people can't be. So I always think that's an irony. But the logical answer is in a free country, things are not always perfect. Which is the sacrifice that we make to live in a free country, that there are always things you can do and always things you cannot
Sure,
do.
sure.
So that's just how that is. Um, but no, I mean, I was very familiar with the fact that the Germans colonized Namibia, which is why I knew that Namibia is the only country on the continent of Africa where everyone speaks German for that very reason. Wasn't specifically familiar with the history, but now I know it, and I'm not at all surprised about all of that. I think that a great percentage of the German population, certainly from Germany, was highly against World War II, having nothing to do with the Nazis for a moment. But certainly everybody was so exhausted from World War One and the Roaring '20s, and then the Depression of the '30s,
Sure.
and the
Absolutely.
Franco of Spain and the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s ish. I think everybody at this point was so pissed off that I don't necessarily think that many German people wanted a conflict in 1939 when Hitler
I'm sure they didn't.
invades Poland.
I'm sure they did.
I think the answer is it was only the monsters at the top of the ladder wanted it, and everybody else
Yeah.
suffered. Is the
Yeah. Well,
answer,
that's it.
and
Yeah. And I think,
more or less everybody suffered. Yes, go ahead. Hmm.
sure. Oh, yeah, completely. Completely.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I only grew interested in the Civil War because I read Hemingway's For Whom the
Hmm.
Bell
For whom
Tolls.
the bell tolls,
That's
right? And
what a
where
wonderful, what
Hemingway,
a, actually,
now
I think it's his finest
Hemingway
book
was a right, yeah, yeah, and Hemingway was an ambulance driver, I
in the
believe, and
First
I
World War.
think
Yeah.
yes, indeed. Now, and this sounds silly. Hemingway though was I forget. Hemingway was in the British Army, was a Royal Army, right? Or was he
No,
an
no,
American?
no. He went as a volunteer, so he might have gone before 1917. Thinking about it now, I actually don't tell you. I don't know the honest truth, but I have a feeling he might have been early. He certainly regarded himself as one of the first Americans to ever have been
Oh,
wounded.
so
He didn't
Hemingway
last
was an
long, you know.
American. Okay, Hemingway was American. I had
He
forgotten
was
that. I wasn't sure if he was
American,
American or
but he
British.
might have
Okay,
he might have gone as a volunteer, as a neutral volunteer, they called them. There was
right.
a whole bunch of Americans came over earlier than 1917 and fought.
Mm,
Um, but it was a little bit unofficial, and so they were supernumeraries for the Allies, which were obviously at that time mostly the English and the French.
right,
Um,
right.
but yeah,
Absolutely.
but anyway, that's beside the point.
Yeah, very, very good. So nowadays in South Africa, moving the history clock forward to today. So, every country has their own way of teaching history to children. So in the South African school systems, South Africa clearly has a rich history. What history is learned in South Africa for children?
That's a very good question. So I must tell you, okay, so there's a very important context to understand here, because of our racial segregation history. Um, we every country's history is somewhat what's the word, edited. There's an old saying,
Absolutely.
until such time that the lions can write, history will always be told on the part of the hunter. And
Hmm.
so every history is written with a bias. And so in South Africa, our history was very dominated by colonial history. And we have a colonial history from before 1652, but largely from 1652, and the Dutch came, and and then the British came in 1806. And what we never were taught as children was anything, or not a hell of a lot, about the Black history, which of course were the indigenous people. Um, and so we had a very, very, very scant historical glance at the indigenous people in the very southern Cape, the south, where Cape Town is. Um, who were called the Khoi and the San. We knew very little, just a little bit. They just teased us a bit with some stuff, much of it wrong, by the way. And then there was incorrect history taught about the African migration down Africa. And there was they colored over, or they brushed over much of the inconvenient truths about Black history in this country. And they would sometimes talk quite a lot about the colonial victorious history and not pay enough attention towards the 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 serious damage done to the Africans and other indigenous or local communities damaged by colonialism. Now, this podcast isn't about judging one or the other. I'm talking about history here, and I get very sad when people want to redress history. So the taking away of statuary which depict soldiers or generals from a war, to me is a sad thing. Changing names, because what you're trying to do is erase history, and that's terrible. You
Yeah,
need to see
yeah.
history, warts and
For
all.
for what it
So,
is, absolutely. And I think that
so
gives us a very good moment here because I want input from the audience here.
please.
Let's go over to South Africa and let's go talk to, of course, let me open the tray here. Let's
You
talk.
said Latabo, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay, definitely. All right, let's open the phone lines here to Latabo, who is in Pretoria. And I'm sure that he has a question and a comment, and he definitely got a kick out of this. So let's see. All right, there he is. Go, Latabo. I know you have some comments to make and a question. You can ask a question, comment, and what do you think, man? And let's give him a moment to open his microphone. We're also joined also by Preston. I don't know, Jeremy. I don't know if you know much about Preston Gaylor, but he is a broadcaster like I am here in the States. He owns a podcast and a radio network, so he's also doing wonderful work for us all over the world. We're also going to open. We're gonna okay, okay. And or either one. Okay, so Preston, either you or Latabo can ask a question, but I definitely want to give you guys a chance to ask one question. So go ahead. It's either one of you. Uh,
Hello, hello there, Jeremy. It's awesome to meet you, and it's a good thing because I came back inside to get more coffee. Gonna be a human out one here today. So, but anyway, it's good to virtually meet you. Uh, my question for you actually, and you did a good part one. I actually caught that episode. I'm gonna have to replay it again because it was so good. But
oh, thank you.
my question for you, sir, is what has been like your biggest breakthrough uh in your country between us here in the States and South Africa? So it's maybe a little
I
twist,
think
but
not at
it's
all, Preston.
interesting.
So let's kind of clarify that, Preston. That's incredible.
Clarify.
You're definitely on the right track. What do you mean by, because I just want to just trying to direct it so that we get the best results possible. By breakthrough, what do you mean, Preston, by breakthrough?
Pretty much what I'm looking at is mainly advancements or technological changes
Yeah, that's a really
or
good question. Okay, I think Jeremy understands. Go.
yeah, got it.
I'm afraid I'm not sure I fully understand. Are you saying what contribution has America had, which has benefited us in South Africa, like
Yes,
technological? Well, I
yeah,
suppose, one. I think, as much as Helen Keller is a slightly controversial subject matter. Helen Keller is strangely unpopular in the disability sector, which I've always found very strange. I
right.
understand it to a degree, but what you can't get away from is that, and beyond her politics or beyond the fact that she was a charity case in many ways, um, is that she demonstrated the ability to utilize resources. So her very, very prolific Braille reading, the fact that she used Annie, as her amanuensis is not the point. Um, she was an incredibly erudite woman, And because she was so extraordinarily well known all around the world, including here, my own father met her. My
Wow.
grandmother
Incredible.
hosted her here in South Africa because she ran that Blind Veterans Association. She was a big deal in the blind world, and so she hosted Helen Keller. So you see, when you now you mustn't get hooked on the negative drama around, oh, did she stand for the charity case and all that nonsense. It's not about that. It's about understanding that this woman was erudite. She was extraordinarily well read. She was an amazing writer. And because of her popularity, she, in many ways, opened many people's eyes to the possibilities of education. So I
Oh
get
yeah.
very frustrated when people it's a bit like political, discourse where you hook onto something negative. And what you do by that is you blind yourself to perspective. It's very important to look at things. I always say you need perspective. You've got to step back. I'm very capable of looking at a conflict, um, which might be controversial, and to try and make the case for both sides. Because and one needs to do that in life. And so that's one. Obviously, I mean, the fact that, I mean, another one would be Braille, but of course, Braille, that's French. What is interesting about Braille, I found, is that it took so long to actually adopt as a universal language or as a universal technique. It took years. Years. It was well into the 1900s before it was actually adopted as a universal thing. And of course, the Perkins
Yes.
Center did more than any other place, I suspect, in the world. I'm still cross with how much they charge for their Braille typewriters, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Not that
I
I do
know.
Braille, but I think, to use a 130-year-old design and to still charge the kind of money they do, I think is iniquitous. But that's another story.
Right. Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, I've owned, well, actually, matter of fact, here in my uh place of uh place of coming to you right now, I do own a Perkins still. I still use it as backup for all my Braille projects and things. And I actually read Lewis Braille's, well, autobiography when I was younger, and I did read Miss Keller's book as well. So we all definitely come a long way, but I feel that there's definitely more need to be done on
Yeah.
all aspects.
She wrote about 20 books, Preston. And if you
Right.
want to read a really clever book, I read it just the other day. Do you know the blind academic Georgina Cleage?
I think
No.
I heard of her.
Ah, brilliant, brilliant. She's wonderful. She's a artist. She's an incredible writer. She teaches English. I mean, she's an academic. She teaches English at college level. She's retired now, although I doubt it very much that she will retire. But she wrote one of the finest commentaries on Helen Keller, which is one of the reasons why I have an
Hmm.
opinion, is because of what she wrote. It's called Blind Rage, Letters to Helen Keller. And it's probably the finest commentary on biography. And it's so clever. I mean, if it'll rate as one of the finest books I've read because it's so clever. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, oh man, don't get me started. South Africa only recently got associated with Bookshare. Quite literally, only in 2020 did we, in fact, get Bookshare in South Africa for no charge, where I now can go on to Bookshare. However, because South Africa hasn't signed the Marrakesh Treaty yet, and it's very frustrating because we were right there during the whole negotiations of Marrakesh and the WIPO Treaty. We had delegates there from the very beginning. We have still not signed it. As a result, we're not part of the WIPO Treaty, which means we can't get full access to Bookshare. So I only have access to about a third of what you do at Bookshare.
So I have a question, by the way. So that Georgina woman you
Yeah,
mentioned, so
yeah.
is you probably can anticipate what's in the back corner of my brain. So is she still with us? Is she still alive, that person?
Yeah, yeah, apparently.
And
Um, think you
do
know
you
what? I
do
can't
you know
remember.
her?
No, I don't, but I know people who
Oh.
do. I have a blind
Ah.
academic friend. two blind academic friends. That one is a professor of psychology at a university here in Cape Town, and the other is a postdoc researcher at the same university. And they both know her because they've participated in, and that's what COVID did for us, of course, was it allowed us to, it brought the world together through
We'll
Zoom,
certainly
right?
talk. Well, after today, Jeremy, we'll certainly talk about getting those two friends of yours to come to Aaron's Opinion. I would love to interview those people. Obviously, they're
Yeah,
so
with
welcome
pleasure.
here. And obviously, you can see where I'm going to stretch my brain and stretch the magic. Obviously, I'm going to ask them, hey, what do you think about getting this Georgina person to come? Because getting to have an intellectual conversation about a character like Helen Keller, who so much mysticism and so much mystery and so much right and so much wrong and ups and downs and in betweens. Boy, oh boy, oh boy, that would be a great listen. And I promise you, that would be a stunning accomplishment for anyone to get to talk about that topic in depth. And that would be
Well, I intend to
stunning.
I want to reach out to her because in our next session we're going to be talking an audio description, and she's written
Yeah,
quite a lot about that. And
definitely.
I want to in fact reach out to her. So
I,
I need to
I
ask
know that
my
I know that you
friends.
will. I know that you will. You'll stretch and give her a reach and say, "Hey, there's this nice man named Aaron's Opinion, and he wants to learn from you." And
Yep. I'll do that.
yeah, I can anticipate that. Listen, my God, that would be it. I'm not like I don't know how many other podcasters have covered this topic in the world, so that would be an incredible listen. Anyway, back to you, Latabo, though. Latabo, do you want to open your microphone, man? Is your headset plugged in over there, man? Because I know that you have a question. Um, I don't know why you didn't say anything. I don't know. Um,
Maybe ask him to put it in chat. Oh, there we go.
yeah.
Oh, it's a pity.
Excuse me.
Oh, he's using his cell phone.
Oh, he is?
Yeah, I've just read
Give me
the chat.
uh, okay. Okay. No matter. No matter. One second. Hold on. Okay. So yeah. So anyway, as far as all this history stuff goes, this is absolutely amazing. So let's see. All right. We have another in part one here of history today. We have another 13 minutes. So Jeremy, let's turn the microphone in the other direction. What
Yeah.
are some some active history questions that you want to learn about me, about the United States, about my perspective on the world? What do you really want to know? Dig under my skin right away and let's really get this going. What do you really want to know?
Well, I'm interested in what is your historical bent? Is there a particular genre which you're
First of all,
interested in?
it's endearing that you already assume that I will present to you a biased history with a bent. I don't do bents. I just have history. That was clever. No, my history doesn't have a slant. The only slant that my history has is that everything I say is true, even all my opinions. But that's why it's history. So
Yeah.
my history dates back definitely to Eastern Europe. As I've told you, I'm a Jewish guy. So my
No,
history
you didn't
dates back.
actually tell me that. I didn't
Well,
realize
now
that.
you know. Well, now you know.
Great.
So I descend from, and proud of it, I descend from Polish Jews.
Okay.
And so because of that, I have a deep knowledge of the history of World War II. And World War One. You mentioned the gas that people would be blinded with in ancient times during the First World War. My great grandfather fought
Hmm.
in that war too in the 101st F Company Engineers. And it's very special. But in our office, I still have his box, and inside his box, I still have his buttons that he wore on his post. He was a postman after the war, and
Huh.
I still have his buttons that he wore in his uniform in the 1920s and 30s. And I still have a tiny little pocket Bible in a tiny little box, and it's written
Wow.
in Quebecois French. And we can
Huh.
still read it, and it's still legible, and the pages are gold. And so, let me tell you that I have some historical relics, and I deeply appreciate history just as much as you. And I
Mm.
think that when you really, put it all together, to understand, American people, like I was saying before in this other part a little earlier today, American people sort of have heard of the Boer War. They've sort of sort of heard of it, but if you ask them, so what does Boer mean? Like, who are the
Yep.
people? They wouldn't be able to tell you.
I'd
And
love
so,
to. I'd love to
yeah,
give you a quick snapshot if you like, because it's a
yeah,
war with a difference. May I
yeah.
do that quickly?
You
I'll
may
give you
certainly give a snapshot. Absolutely,
a
yes.
quick skinny. So it's once again, it's because history tends to become revisionist when there are changes in a country, and our country's gone through a change from a colonial and then a sort of regime, a rather not quite fascist, but certainly a very a nationalist regime, followed by what we have now, which is a country open for all, for freedom, a one man, one vote kind of thing. Anyway, so the Boer War is looked at with a jaundiced eye by people of color, black people in this country, but because it was so badly taught. I had the privilege, and I'll talk about it in our next session, of doing. I'm doing it at the moment, so it hasn't been released yet. But we're doing an audio description of the Boer War Museum right here in Bloemfontein, where I'm sitting, where I happen to be doing other work. Anyway, so the war, a couple of outcomes of the war are really frightening. Firstly, it's the first time where we saw the use of what's called concentration camps. These were not meant for the combatants. These were not prisoner of war camps. These were for the women and children. So the British burned the farms, and they burned 8,000 farms. And as a what do they call that? Slash and burn. There's another term for it. I forgot. Where if you burn the people out and you can't, so they can't eat. The Boer soldiers were hemmed into certain areas and were literally herded like cattle, and many of them captured near the end. So the point is, the farms were burned, and the women and children were taken to the concentration camps. And the upshot was that 26,000 women and children died in those camps during that short war. It was only from June 1900 on to early 1902. Now, the combatants went anywhere but South Africa. There were camps in St. Helena, there were camps in India, camps in then Ceylon, which of course is now Sri Lanka, and there were even camps in Bermuda. And the soldiers and they were treated much better. They were better fed, they were better housed, but the women were terribly treated. Now, here's the bit that's never been taught. And I've just learned it now. I'm 61 years old, and I've only just realized how bad it was, is that no one was ever taught about the lot of the black South Africans affected by that war. So there's two sides to it. On the one hand, the Boer soldiers had retainers who had been associated with their farms. They were staff from their farms. They were employees, and they were often very loyal. And they were literally retainers, and they fought alongside the Boers, not so much in a combatant situation, although I suspect they often enough was combatant, but it was unofficial. But largely, in a support idea. Many of them would have been captured too, and I've yet to discover what happened to them, by the way. Then there were the women and children associated with those retainers. So when the farm is burned and the white owner of the farm and child were taken into a disgusting concentration camp, which was riddled with disease,
Right.
the black women were taken into even worse camps. And so when there's 26,000 white women and children dying in that war, and there were over 26, 7, 8, no one knows the proper number of black women and children dying in even worse camps. You can't even imagine the camp. Picture Andersonville. If you know your Civil War history, you'll know about Andersonville. And what made Andersonville so really savage and disgusting was that there was almost no shelter provided. So you got a camp a mile in perimeter, and no shelter was provided. They had to find their own shelter. That's why so many men died. Now, those camps were very much like the black concentration camps that the women and children were forced into. Now, what's interesting about this is one of the situations which you never understand. So if you add the 26,000 and the 28 odd thousand men, women and children who died, so that's now over 50,000 deaths. Only 4,000 Boers died, and
Yeah.
20,000 British died, mostly from disease, by the way. So that's where the civilians died in greater numbers, by double, in fact, and more than the actual combatants. I mean, how interesting is that?
Very, extremely. And it's all information that I will certainly learn about. Most people have never heard this level of history, of this level of historical knowledge. I got to tell you, your knowledge of history is just stellar. I kind of forgot, how many books have you published about history again? How many books have you secretly written?
Not a one.
Not a well, maybe you should, because maybe you want to write these things down, and maybe you want to do your own little journal sometime, because people deserve the truth that you have given them, you see?
Well,
So maybe you
Aaron,
should consider that. Yeah.
I don't, in the words of Paul McCartney, who said, "I'm a
Well, what
lover, not
about
a
in well,
fighter.
what about in
I'm
Jeremy
a I'm a
Opperman's
I'm a reader,
words?
not a writer." um, but you know what? What you're doing now, and this, I've got quite interested in doing podcasting. Simply, not so much. I not necessarily want to do it myself, but storytelling doesn't have to be written,
Right.
and you're
That's
proving that.
true.
And so
That's
this
true.
sort
This
of
is
thing,
an
I
incredible,
would do this all
incredible.
day because
This
I'm
is
a
an
storyteller.
incredible thing. Certainly, it's incredible because we are creating together. We're all creating a permanent record of this knowledge for sure, that will be listened to forever. So this never goes away. All this knowledge, absolutely. But so very very wonderful. I do want to yeah, I do want to stay with the times here, as we say. All right, 4 minutes on the segment here. I'm going to give you one more question. I'm going to say, so Jeremy, if you can ask me one question about American history, one more question, and then we'll wrap it up for history. What do you want to know?
Um, wow. I mean, American history happens to be probably my favorite history. So I've read a great deal of American history. Um, so I know quite a lot about American history. I'm not saying I know it all by any means. I'm really not. So when did your people come to America
Great.
from Poland?
My people, so the Jewish people that I descend from, we believe that they came obviously before the war. So anywhere from the years 1910 to 1930. It has been something that I've never been able to fully unearth. Obviously, you would not be
Mm-hmm.
surprised to know, and you would understand
Mm,
this, that obviously documentation, which is why you should write things down and talk on podcasts, because documentation in
mm-hmm.
society in the 20th century certainly was not existent. Even in Eastern Europe, it was non-existent. Certainly in the continent of Africa, they didn't write anything down until the early 2000s. So there was a huge gap in documentation. Anyway, that's what I think. And those people would settle in Washington, D.C., and eventually my mother would be born in Washington, D.C., and so would I eventually in the year 1991. Jeremy Opperman, fabulous segment on history. I got to tell you, I could not have possibly asked for anything better. That was a 10-star experience. That was a PhD history class right there. I think we'll have other PhD friends of yours looking up, just learning from that episode, because all that knowledge you gave, I mean, someone could do a full research paper just on that. All right. So what we're going to do now is I'm actually gonna actually, because you have done such a superior, but I gotta tell you, you've done a superior job with staying on track and on time, and I tremendously appreciate it. Now what I'm gonna do is actually let's see here. All right, we're gonna turn off that. All right, I'm gonna turn off my camera. I am actually gonna say, all right, I'm gonna stop here. So here's what I'm gonna do before I do it. I'm gonna actually stop this recording. I'm gonna mute for just a second, uh, get a drink of water, stretch my legs for just a moment, and then in just a couple minutes, like in 2 minutes, I'm gonna come back. So we're gonna take a little. Well, let's say we're gonna take a little 3 to 5 minute pause, and then just don't change anything. Just stay right there, and then I'll be back in just a minute here. All
Sure,
right.
sure.
So anyway,
Okay.
that was Aaron's opinion, part one, history with Jeremy Opperman. And all right, now I gotta okay. So yeah, so thank you so much, everybody. History, that was part one, history with Jeremy Opperman. Thank you so much, everybody, and help one person today, help 1 million people tomorrow. All right. Back.
Right.
I
thought you'd gone for a moment.
I did.
No,
All right.
I thought I had lost you.
No. Just all right. There we are. All right. Let me do this here. Let me say a voiceover on.
Okay. Pause button. 2:16. 1 hour. Delete. Formed action. Delete. 0 minutes. 1 hour. Delete. Formed action.
Okay,
Delete.
yeah, so that's that. Voiceover off. All right. Now we're going to dig into part 2, just about audio description. So then in that case, here we go with that. So, all right. All right, on this, okay, excellent. All right, here we go. Part 2, audio description only, starting in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of our conversation today with Jeremy Opperman. All right, part 2. You're also passionate about audio description. That whole wealth of knowledge that you have in audio description, I'm not concerned if you're able to talk about it because I know you are. So let's just dive deep into this one. Audio description, go, and we'll just dive in. And you have about 57 minutes for this one. So just go for it. Dive straight in. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I am not an expert in audio description. I'm a devotee. I am a passionate devotee of audio description. I am I'm a user. I am, and I do some audio description myself. Very early, very early. I'm able to talk passionately about it, and because I love it so, and because I have a very vivid imagination, and because of my reading, I suppose, I have a grasp of things that would be lovely to see if you could see. And so I have a sort of motto, if you like. I call it the things we miss. And I'm not sure when I became conscious of the things we miss. You know, we in Cape Town, we have a big mountain right in the middle of the city. I don't know if you know about Cape Town, that we have a mountain. And let me describe it to you. In fact, that's part of audio description, isn't it? So we have a town which was centered initially in a bay, and on the one side of an iconic looking mountain. So for those of you who don't know what Table Mountain looks like, picture a mountain about 2 miles wide. On the left-hand side, you have, and this is facing the mountain with the sea to your back. In the back, the sea is what's called Table Bay. And essentially, it's facing the Atlantic Ocean. And if you go 3,000 miles due west, you will hit Brazil. You'll literally hit Rio de Janeiro. So that's where South Africa and Cape Town is geographically. Now, with your back to the sea and you look towards the east, you will see, if you could see, a mountain. On the left, there is a peak, quite a sharp peak. It's exactly 3,640 feet high, which is not terribly high from mountain points of view, but you must remember that you're at sea level now. And so many mountains which are higher, so your McKinley, for instance, your Mount McKinley, which is, I think, your highest mountain, is 17,000 feet. But what you must remember is that you're not starting from sea level. You're already starting from quite high up. You're starting from well over 5,000 feet before you even begin to climb McKinley. So that just gives you an idea of relativity. But in Cape Town, 3,640 feet odd is a left-hand peak. And it's a typical conical peak, really. It's called Devil's Peak. Immediately to its right, and spanning about a mile, is an incredibly iconic looking mountain because it's flat, which is why it's called Table Mountain. And so the what's called a saddle, or the valley between Devil's Peak and Table Mountain, is quite high up, but it's a classic valley or a classic saddle or a pass, if you like. And so then you have this Table Mountain. Now, the mountain is slightly less than 3,640 feet. I'm not even sure of what it is, but it's over 3,000 feet. Once again, it's right next door to the Devil's Peak. So you're looking at it. So on the left-hand side, you've got the conical peak of Devil's Peak. Immediately to the right, spanning about a mile, which is 1.6 kilometers for those who use the metric system. You've got the flat-topped mountain. Now, when you get up there, it's not quite as flat as you can see from the ground, but it certainly looks flat. It's almost level. If you put a spirit level on it, it would feel like it was level. And it's extraordinary. It really is incredible. And then after about a mile, there's another valley, or a pass, if you like, slightly lower this time. And then you get to another, not quite so conical, but a classic mountain shape, which is called Lion's Head, and which is made up of a taller peak and then a slightly lower one. The mountain part, the lion part, by the way, is when you look at it from certain angles, the one part of the lower hill, which is called Signal Hill, resembles the rump of a lion, and the rest of the lion. So it looks like a bit of a lion from a certain angle, apparently. Even when I could see, I couldn't work that out. Not that I could ever see well. Now, so that's Table Mountain, and it dominates, obviously it would, being about 2 miles wide, it dominates the entire vista of Cape Town. So when the Dutch came in they came literally to colonize in 1652, but the Portuguese came as early as 1480, and when they first saw this extraordinary mountain. And so it's iconic. I mean, it's one of the UNESCO natural history sites. So that's an example. So as a boy, I could always see the mountain. It was my friend. And the city, of course, grew around the mountain. And you get the different perspectives. On the side, you don't see the big flat top. You only see Devil's Peak, or on the other side, you see something else. And then when you go to the back, you don't see the flat top quite as much because the vista of the mountain changes. But I know I think I'm going back to history, but I'm not. What I'm getting to is audio description, because what I'm telling you is what people have told me. I could perceive the mountain only to a degree. It was only ever a silhouette. I could never see the detail. But what fascinated me, because I was at a school which has a gorgeous view of Devil's Peak from the, let's see, west, east, so it would be from the northern side of the mountain, the suburbs surrounding the mountain in the north slightly. Still on the very early slopes of the mountain, is the University of Cape Town, which is probably one of the most attractive universities in the world. If you were to Google a picture and you could see well enough, I dare you to do it and to defy it. It's on the slopes of Devil's Peak. It's steep, and it's built in the early 1900s, or the early part of it, and so it's got columns and marble steps and stone buildings, gorgeous. Anyway, my school was about 2 kilometers, about a mile and a half from the university. So slightly flatter ground, but you could see up to this extraordinary mountain. And my friends would always say during wintertime, oh, look at the waterfall, look at the waterfall, or look at the Rhodes Memorial, which is a memorial site. And they could see it and I couldn't. And so I became reliant on their stories. Describe the waterfall, I would say. In 1974, we had a tragic accident of 3 military airplanes crashing into the mountain in the fog, one after the other, right above the university. Bang, 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 bang. And we could hear it. And there was smoke. Even though when the fog cleared, there was smoke. Could you imagine 3 jets? They were Impala jets. And they all, no, I lied, they were Buccaneer jets. And they all crashed into the mountain. And even when the cloud cleared and the smoke cleared, and the fog cleared, you could see the smoke. I couldn't, they could. And so audio description is something I've grown up with. I was enormously curious. And so I would ask and ask and ask. I must have frustrated the hell out of my parents and my friends because I constantly say, describe it to me, tell me about it. So that's my first impression of audio description. And then, of course, there came television and movies. And so I could never really appreciate movies. I didn't like movies particularly because I could never really get them. I would have to sit very close, and my friends and family didn't like to sit in the front row. And even if I did sit in the front row, it was too close, really. And so you only got part of the action, and we could never appreciate the action as such. So I was drawn rather to illustrated things that I could see, like those comics I spoke about. So people had to describe stuff to me in the movies, which of course frustrates everybody else in the movie. I would say, what's happening? What's happening? What's happening? And I remember when I was at university, we were watching The Clan of the Cave Bears, and I was with my friends, both women and men. And I was saying, what's happening? What's happening? And the scene in the movie happened to be quite an intimate scene of a sexual nature. And the girl I was sitting next door to was too shy to describe it to me. I'll never forget that. And so as blind people, we are all exposed to audio description all the time, particularly if we're curious. And the more curious you are, the more audio description you will be subjected to, if you're lucky. So I want to fast forward really to my first formal interaction with audio description. I was extraordinarily lucky to meet the father of audio description. Now, I want to introduce another individual here into the story. So I have a friend, a blind friend, someone you might want to interview as well. Her name is Shakila Maharaj. And Shakila is an interesting woman in her own right. She did psychology at university, and then she did her master's at Columbia in New York. And Shakila has followed a corporate degree, but like me, she was fascinated by audio description. Unlike me, she's very proactive. And she reached out to the father of audio description. And I wonder if you know who the father of audio description is. It's a man called Joel Snyder. And Joel is the most wonderful gentleman. I mean, the best description. In Yiddish, you would call him a mensch. He is literally a mensch. And in the 70s and 80s, Joel began to be interested in audio description and formalizing it and putting it into theater. And Joel did more for audio description than any person alive, I believe. He's got a PhD in audio description, certainly probably the first person to do so, in fact. Almost certainly the first person to get a PhD in audio description. He wrote a book called The Visual Made Verbal. Anyway, Shakila, being as proactive as she was, brought Joel out to South Africa. And Shakila hosted him in Durban and Johannesburg, and I hosted him in Cape Town. And so I hosted him and facilitated him running a workshop, a 3-day workshop on audio description, which I attended. And then I had a day to kill. And I offered to show him around the town. It's a very pretty town. It's a gorgeous town. Because of the mountain and because it's colonial, this interesting architecture. And so I showed him around. And we found ourselves, he wanted to see the Great Synagogue in Cape Town, which I showed him. And we went into the basement, and there was a mock-up of a shtetl. And he talked me through everything. And then we went to the National Gallery, which is in a very beautiful campus of museums in Cape Town called the Government Gardens, they're called. And the Government Gardens, Governor's Gardens, they're called. Anyway, in the Governor's Gardens are a bunch of museums, and in there is the National Gallery. And I had the privilege of spending almost an entire day with the father of audio description, talking me through the various visual arts. Now, I want to add something to audio description. And Georgina Cleage, who I mentioned in the previous section, has written about this in her book, whose name I fear I have forgotten. I can't remember the name of the book. It'll come to me, though. And essentially, we mustn't forget the wonders of the tactile experience, which have a very big role to play in audio description. Because when you can feel something, it adds to the entire picture. So what I'll be doing for you just now is I've already audio described the mountain for you. Hopefully I did a decent job. And I'd like to describe a couple of things for you to show you how well audio description can be transmitted to a blind person. Because the only reason I can describe what I'm going to describe to you is because it was so well described in the first place. I have a rather good memory, and so I'm able, and because I love history, it helps, you see, because I understand context. And it helps a great deal. So if you see a painting and you have no affinity with it, then the description, you might do a decent job, but it'll be quite clinical, really. But if you can relate to the image in some way, I believe it helps. But I don't want to prescribe those, it's not necessary, I suspect. But from my point of view, the reason I remember it well is because I picture it in my head. So let me tell you a classic painting. And Joel Snyder himself audio described this painting somewhere in America. They're actually not in America, it's in Europe, but the actual painting, I suspect. Although, mind you, it might actually be in one of your galleries. So I don't know where it lies at the moment. But it's by Titian. Now, Titian was a 16th century painter in Italy, in Florence, and he painted many scenes from Greek mythology. And so this painting is called Venus and Adonis. Now, it's a very green forest scene. And you see the grasslands, but it's very foresty, very green. And you see Venus, who is quite naked. And she's sitting on a couch. Now, you might scratch your head a little bit about what on earth a couch is doing in a forest, but don't overthink it. This is Greek mythology, after all. And so Venus, of course, is a senior god in the Greek pantheon, and she's sitting on a couch, quite naked, but she's almost always depicted as naked, by the way. And she's reaching with her right hand, and she's literally clutching at a man who is leaving her. He's walking away from her. He's quick. He's clearly wrenching himself away from her. Her arm is still half on his chest, trying to pull him back. In fact, she's torn his shirt. You can see that his tunic is, in fact, wrenched aside so that you can see his chest underneath. His tunic is rose-colored. And he's wearing hunter's garb. He's got what imagines would be skin trousers, quite tight. And they only go up to just above his calves, and he's got great big muscular calves. He is, of course, Adonis. Adonis is still, to this day, we talk about a muscular man being called Adonis. And he's got great big calves. He's barefoot. He's holding an enormous 6-foot spear in his left hand. Now, remember, he's walking away from her. So he's walking to the right. She's sitting on the left. And in his right hand, he's holding 3 wolfhounds who are straining at the leash. Once again, you can see the musculature in his strong right arm as the leash is wrapped around his arm. And what's interesting is that 2 of the dogs are straining at the leash with their tails wagging and up. And one of the dogs has this tail between his legs. What's that telling us? Now, she's clearly distressed because she's trying to hold him back. Now, I understand, I actually don't know the story very well, but in Greek mythology, this is Adonis's last journey, because the reason he's holding a great 6-foot spear is because he's on a boar hunt. He's off to hunt boar. And in the story, he dies just after this incident because he is killed by a boar. And so I think because Venus, of course, is a god, she knows what's going to happen, doesn't she? And so that's why she's holding him back. And just a little bit of extra detail, there's Cupid. The famous Cupid is lounging on a hillside in the distance. And there's a golden chalice, clearly must have held wine, one imagines, is dashed to the ground in the left. And so that's Titian's Venus and Adonis. And I hope, I could visualize that. I've never seen it. I've literally never even looked at a picture of it, even if I could see. I've never even had somebody look at the picture and tell me that I'm right or wrong. I think I'm pretty much accurate because Joel Snyder, the father of audio description, described that for me. Well, not for me. He described it. I've heard the recording. I have the recording. It's my favorite painting. And I could do that all day because I know many artworks, statuary and art, and even photography, where that they have been beautifully described. So what I'm telling you here is that
absolutely, yeah, yeah. So let me just interject as we walk through. So, by the way, do you have access to that Joel Snyder recording of that painting?
I do. I can send it to you.
You do.
I
Okay.
do.
If you're sure that you do, then we're actually going to say we're actually going to put it in. We're going to put it in right here into the audio. So just give me 1 minute. So actually, listeners, so the listener for sure would want to hear Joel Snyder's interpretation.
I don't think I can play it now though, because you wouldn't hear
No,
it.
I know we can't, but
you
you'll
know
give it
this.
to
So
me,
I'll send it to you.
and I'll
Yeah.
sneak it in by doing this. So we'll say,
yeah.
So we'll say, so you're going to listen, and now here's Joel Snyder's recording, audio description of that painting. Okay,
Oh,
so
cool.
here it is. Yeah. And now we're going to say, okay, all right. So there was that. Now, good, excellent. And so,
Great.
yeah, I think you did a really good job of expressing it. Okay, so now from here, what are some other areas of audio description that really stand out to you? Yeah.
What stands well? So I'm just demonstrating the power of audio description, and I hope you
Absolutely.
got it. So the other part is structure. So I described the mountain for you. I could describe an airplane for you. I could describe anything that I've had the privilege of having some knowledgeable person talking to me about. And I got very interested in, and I mentioned this woman, Shakila Maharaj. Now, Shakila had started an audio description company in South Africa, and which is the only audio description company in South Africa. And it specialized mostly in movies. Now, you'll appreciate that most audio description, most of us are familiar with the audio description provided by the networks. Now, in America, you're much more, and the rest of the world, many of your channels provide audio description. But in South Africa, our actual television network does not. And the only exposure to audio description that we have is either we pirate it, we take it off the, things like Three Blind Mice or Audio Vault, and it's you could argue about the copyright of it, or Netflix, because we have Netflix in South Africa, but we don't have Amazon Prime unless you well, you have to pay for Netflix, but I don't know a single person here who does. We don't have we do have Apple TV, it's true, but I don't actually know many people who watch it. We don't have HBO at all. So we don't get exposed to a great deal of audio description, only Netflix. And now, obviously, many of us love the productions. I'm always fascinated by what isn't audio described. The Good Doctor, for instance, which is a show that a lot of people know, and it's a very important show because it highlights autism, isn't audio described. Not that I can find, not in South Africa. It might be in America, but it's not. And that begs a question, which is an appalling indictment, frankly. Anyway, so there's the whole movie thing. And Shakila has ensured that audio description is on the map because she has approached the film commissions, and her company provide audio description for local made movies. And okay, fine. Sorry about the correction. My point is, I've never encountered it. Is the point I'm making. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't exist.
Backseat, love that from the peanut gallery, from the audience. Backseat driving, they're correcting the
it's a backseat. Yeah, it's a peanut gallery.
Oh boy, that was cute. That's amazing. That was good. That's good. That's
anyway,
material. Yeah.
So I work with Shakila, and so I had one of the beauties of one of the geniuses of Shakila's company is that they do blind verification. And I cannot, what's the word, overemphasize the importance of blind verification in audio description. Now, I have a bit of experience in verification because 35 years ago, I volunteered as a verifier for audiobook reading. and not yes, audiobook reading. So the Blind Library had a free audiobook service, and it's not like audiobooks as in audiobooks we know today, where some of our favorite actors narrate books. This is volunteers reading books. Okay, so it's called Library for the Blind, and for a long time they had not blind, they had verifiers, they had monitors who listened to the recording as live while it was happening, and you could stop a recorder, you could stop a narrator. And I called them up and I bullied my way into being, and I was the only blind narrator, not narrator, blind verifier or blind monitor in Tape Aids for the Blind. Sorry, it was Tape Aids for the Blind. It wasn't the other one, which is another company. Anyway, and it was fascinating. I did it for a couple of years. So I listened very carefully. And because I'm well read, I was able to correct people on pronunciation, and they probably hated me, but I didn't care, because as far as I'm concerned, if an audiobook is badly read, it's not worth the airtime. And so I had experience already. So one of the things that Shaquila's company is known for is blind verification, where a blind person listens to the script and before it's even narrated, so that we can say, actually, you know what, you haven't covered the detail enough. We might not know what the movie's exactly looking like, but the detail is important. What are you missing? And this is something I want to talk about quickly, is the quality of audio description, which varies. I'm sure any blind person listening to this will verify that there are good audio description and there are bad audio description copies or recordings. And I've seen some appalling audio, or heard some appalling audio description lately on Netflix.
Huh.
Now, I'm not sure if I can blame Netflix for this, but apparently I can, because Netflix commission audio description themselves. And quite frankly, I think sometimes they get quite lazy, or they use audio description companies who don't do a particularly good job. Now, if you don't have a blind verifier, the sighted guy is unlikely to pick up some of the objections that I'm going to pick up. And it's become, I'm sure I'm not alone in the listeners here, there's a lot of chatter out there about the quality of audio description. You know, should you have a woman narrating a woman scene? Should you have a black guy narrating a black character? That sort of thing. So there's a great deal of complexity in the game. Anyway, so that's what Shaquila does. But then I got involved with her to do a bit of verification. But I'm fascinated by statuary. I love sculpture, and so I said, let me describe some sculptures. And so she was keen for me to do that, and so I did. And so I described, and I'd like, if you're open to it, I'd like to describe a sculpture and see if you get it. So in Cape Town, we have a suburb also on the seafront called Sea Point. And on that, it's a long promenade, probably 3 miles long, and maybe not like, maybe 2 miles long. And there's a grass verge, so it's right on the seaside. It's a rocky coast. And in that grass promenade, there are many, many exciting things. There's a children's train where they can sit on this train that goes around a big track. There are gyms, you know, the outdoor gym equipment, which is lovely. And then there are very interesting sculptures. And so I was going to do one for you, but I've changed my mind, and I'm going to do one which I haven't done before, but I've just seen it. So I'm going to do this as live, man. So I'm going to do this al fresco, because I haven't even written the script yet, but I reckon I could do it. So it is extraordinary. So if you were to look at it from the side, you would see nothing. You would see 7 or 8 pieces of arbitrary metalwork in very strange sizes and designs. If you look at any one of the 8, and they're all about 5, 6, 7 yards yards apart, meters apart. A yard and a meter are similar. So they're about 6 or 7 meters, 20 foot, about 20 foot apart, each one of them. And there are 7 or 8 of them, I forget which. And they're obscure on their own. If you look at any one of them, or even feel any one of them, they would mean nothing. absolutely nothing. However, the most extreme item on the right looks like and feels like a rifle sight. So it's a stand. You have to stand up on a platform, and then you hold your hands like a periscope of a submarine on either side, and you look through what is clearly looks like the crosshairs of a rifle sight, if you can picture that. If you can't picture it, cross your fingers in front of you like a cross, and imagine you were looking through the center of the intersection of the cross. That's what's called a crosshair in a sight. And when you look through that crosshair, you see, if you can see, you see a sculpture of a rhinoceros, but it's made up of 8 different parts. So when looked at from the side, it means nothing, but only makes sense when you look at it through the crosshairs of that rifle. And it's got a very clever name. It's called rhinosaur, as in dinosaur. So what it's really, it's a commentary on potential extinction, because the rhino is an endangered animal, very, very much endangered of extinction. There's a very good chance that your children, if you have young children, when they're adults, there's a good chance that there won't be a rhino in the world. So, because they are targets for poachers, and the poachers take the horn and they send the horn to the east to grind them up for aphrodisiacs. That's the only reason. It's its only value. And so they die like flies. So you can see the sculpture only through the crosshairs of that site. So I don't know what it's called. I'm sure in the artistic world, they've got a term for a conglomeration of things which make up an image when you see it in a certain angle. And that is the one that I wanted to talk to you about. So what did you think? Did you get it, Aaron?
Absolutely, yes. Very clear description. Very, very beautiful description. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, there we go. Well, that was al fresco, I might tell you. Meaning I did it I did it on the fly.
Oh, okay.
So so that leads me to the tactile experience, which I want to talk, because I think it has a strong.
Absolutely.
So here's the thing. So recently I saw a statue, a sculpture, which moved me a great deal. It's associated with the Anglo-Boer War, which I spoke about in our previous episode. And the Anglo-Boer War has moved me greatly, particularly because I am a feminist. I'm a history fan, but I'm also a diversity practitioner. That is my trade. So I specialize in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But obviously, I have a disability bent or a disability angle on it. And I'm also very interested in gender equity and gender empowerment, women's empowerment, obviously. Now, women have had it rough over the generations. You know, it's ridiculous that we only got the vote, you know, in the 20s. It's ridiculous that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to knock on hundreds of law firms in 3 states and not get a job. You know, so I'm very interested in women's rights. And there's a statue. It's the Women's Memorial Statue commemorating the tragedy of the women who died in the concentration camps during the Boer War. So let me describe to you. Now, here's the thing. And this is where tactile is so useful. I was allowed into the vault of the museum because I wanted to feel the guns. I wanted to feel the rifles, the swords, the bayonets, the pistols. I wanted to feel the armory that was, you know, the ammunition that was used during the war. And of course, that's not for the average person to feel in a museum, obviously. So they let me into the vault and I was allowed to feel those things. And while I was there, I touched something and I said, "Oh, what's this?" And they said, "It's a maquette." Now, if you know anything about art or sculpture, which I don't know a great deal about, but a maquette is a miniature sculpture of what eventually will become the master sculpture. So, you know, Eiffel and the other chaps that were involved in the creation of the Statue of Liberty would have created a maquette, a small statue that would literally have been only probably a foot high, which gave people an idea of what the big thing would look like eventually. So that's called a maquette. And so they said, "Oh, it's a maquette." of this women's memorial sculpture. And the sculptor is a famous South African Dutch sculptor in those days called Anton van Vo. And he did the sculpture in 1913, or rather, he finished it in 1913. I assume it took a long time. Now, here it is. Let me tell you about it. So I was shown it, and somebody described the sculpture to me, and quite frankly, not very well. Because one reason is it's 30 feet up on a pedestal. It's very big too. It's way bigger than life size. And it depicts two women and a child. But because I could feel the maquette, because the maquette was small, the maquette was quite literally only about 10 inches high, I was able to, which is about 200 millimeters, by the way, I was able to feel everything. And it's in gross detail, incredible detail, the maquette. I could literally feel way more about the way the women were standing, or the one standing, the one sitting. I could feel way more about the child than the audio describer told me. Now, so here it is. So picture this. Now, what's very special, it's got a very interesting history, this statue. So during the Boer War, there was a fascinating woman called Emily Hobhouse. And she was a British woman who came out and threw a fit when she saw how badly the women were being treated in those concentration camps. And she lobbied the British Parliament to change the conditions. And she had great success. And the Boer women to this day revere her. There's even a submarine named after her. And so she's an absolute iconic heroine in South Africa, in white South African culture, if you like. So here's the thing. She was on a station, which was where the women had to congregate to the station in order to get onto a train to take them to a concentration camp. And on the platform of the station, she encountered two women holding a child. And she was very moved, and she wrote in her diary. And so this is why I'm able to describe it, because I've read what she wrote. But let me tell you what she saw. She then told Anton van Vo about it. He had a different sculptor in mind entirely. And when he heard her story and read what she wrote, he changed his mind and he produced this sculpture. So picture this. There's a woman sitting on a bench. Now, the Dutch in those days wore what was called a kappie, which was a bonnet, very much like the frontier women would have worn a bonnet, very similar thing. In fact, identical, to tell you the truth. So they would have worn a bonnet. Now, the bonnet isn't important in this picture, but this gives you an idea of the dress. The women's dress would be long, very long, right down to the ground, long sleeves, very conservative. These were frontier women, if you like. I mean, very conservative. Now, the woman is sitting on a bench, and she's holding a child. The child's not tiny. The child is clearly little more than a toddler. I would suspect the child is probably 3 or 4. The child is utterly limp in her hands, in her arms. And we can see that because the left arm of the child, the girl, is dangling down, and the legs are limp. So picture that tragic scene of this woman holding this utterly limp child. The child is obviously dead or dying, and the head is clutched to the woman's breast. But what's haunting about this is that the woman isn't looking at the child. She's looking dead ahead. She's looking straight ahead in an almost catatonic stare. And Emily Hobhouse said that she wasn't even crying. But the woman behind her, who is clearly her friend, has her hand on the right shoulder of the woman and isn't looking down at the child or even her friend, but she's looking at right angles. And remember, she's standing slightly behind her, so she's looking into the distance at right angles, almost looking into the mountains, if you like. And there's such a desperate feeling about the way this woman is staring, as if to say, what more? What more do you want from me, God? And that is the Women's Memorial. Now, yes. I would never have got such a visceral connection with the statue had I not been able to feel the maquette.
Right. Yeah, it's a really beautiful description for sure. Excellent. Excellent. We have I can give you another eight, just to let you know, another 15 to 18 minutes, just to let you
Yeah,
know.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. But
So
yeah, you're definitely painting a very deep picture of the importance of audio description, you know. It's something else too that intrigued me, and I didn't quite understand what it was, so let's go back to it a little. You said that you also have volunteered and worked as a audio description verifier. So I guess it's obvious to us blind people, but if there's a sighted person tuning in and listening, they wouldn't fully grasp this. So what do us blind people look for when we hear a
good.
good audio description? I think that's a very subtle and a very important concept.
It is subtle. So you may have seen a very, very, very good rendition of an excellent book. It quite came out earlier this year. All the Light We Cannot See. And of
Indeed.
course, what made it famous was the fact that it had a blind actress. So everybody's seen it, right? And there's a particular scene in there which had the audio description been sloppy, they would have overlooked something. Now, it's not significant in any form or frame. It's not pivotal. It's not going to make a difference if they put it in or not. But the fact that they put it in meant that the texture of the movie, for me, was even better, or the series. So it was right at the end. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. And so the heroine, Marie-Laure, after the most traumatic experience. Now, this is now the 6th episode, and she's gone through what nobody should go through in a wartime scene in France with bombing, Allied bombing, I might add, which is all true, by the way. So essentially, the story is about a town on the coast of France, and there is now, it's a post D-Day, and so the Allies are now advancing in France, and the town has been locked up by the Germans. They won't let the people leave. And anyway, she goes through bombings, and she, she's surprisingly not killed in this whole incident. Anyway, she finally gets out, and she's going to throw something in the water. But what I loved about it was you suddenly realize that she's barefoot. And you realize this only because the audio describer has taken the trouble to tell you that. And she's run through glass and bomb sites. And so one imagines her feet aren't in great shape. And so she's standing on the beach. And what I loved, what really moved me, was it said, as she's standing at the edge of the water, about to hurl this thing into the sea, is that it said something like, her bloodied and dirty feet on the sand, and then the waves come over and wash over them. But so that image for me was incredibly powerful. So it's on one level, you could say a lazy audio describer would say, for heaven's sakes, do you really need to know? And I would argue, absolutely, because if you're going to put it in the movie and you're going to see those bloodied and dirty feet, then why shouldn't we know about the bloodied and dirty feet? And what lazy audio describers do is that they overlook certain things where there's an action scene, and it's very difficult. Audio description is not easy. A lot of it's about timing. Well, it's all about timing, exquisitely intricate timing, because you've got a time track. Now, you don't want to interfere. I remember Joel Snyder telling us, when the audio description of Star Wars. Now, Star Wars, as you might remember, although you're a bit young to have seen the original, of course, Aaron, but I suspect you might have seen,
Indeed.
maybe you've seen the latest one.
I've watched through all of them. Yeah, bits and pieces.
Okay,
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
So you know the music. So everyone knows the music. Music's brilliant, right? Now, now the point about that is that George Lucas paid a fortune for that music. So you don't want to mess with the music either. So you've got to time the audio description. One, it mustn't interfere with dialogue. The audio description cannot bump into dialogue. Two, you don't want to take over a classic music scene either, because music, as we know, tells us a great deal in a movie. So it's all about exquisite timing. And there's always gaps. There's gaps between dialogue. There's gaps between action. And so the audio description is extremely difficult. It's not an easy science, which is why it is, in fact, it is recognized as both a science and an art form. And it takes a great deal of skill to write a script with the timing taken into account. So what they do is they look at the track, at the sound track, and they say, right, we've got 3.2 seconds there. That's long. You can say a hell of a lot in 3.2 seconds. But here we've only got half a second. Can we say something in there? Yeah, you can actually say something in half a second. Not a lot, but you can. And so the movie, it's all about looking at the gaps. Now, the audio describer, and this is why a blind person can't do an audio description entirely alone because you don't know what's happening, but you will certainly have sighted help. But so I'm not suggesting that blind people necessarily need to do audio description. What I am saying, though, is that a blind person should verify or have a role in the editing so that, one, we choose the right language so that you don't overuse certain adjectives, certain words, you don't dumb it down too much, and that you don't over doll it up, you don't over glamify the language. This is not an essay. This is not meant to in any way compete with the movie. It has to be quite clinical. You don't add in extra enunciation or emphasis, for instance. You wouldn't, for instance, put an exclamation mark in an audio description script. That's not your job. The movie is there. Your job is to describe what others can. You don't need to describe what's being said. We can hear it. It gets more complicated when there's other language. I remember seeing an audio description of Clint Eastwood's Iwo Jima, and the entire dialogue of Iwo Jima is in Japanese. So you've got the complication of translation, in other words, subtitles. Someone's got to read those subtitles on the audio description, and the actual audio description of what's going on. So then you've got almost a three-dimensional element there. So this is not an easy game. And it's expensive because people cost money. And in what is tragic about this is that, listen, movie making is expensive anyway. And is there sufficient budget to do justice to it in an audio description way? And sadly, clearly not, because I've seen and heard some appalling audio description where whole important things, for instance, race. Is it important to know if the guy's black or white or the woman's black or white? Now, if they've taken the trouble to make it in the movie, why not? But then you get a movie like Bridgerton, a series like Bridgerton, where the Brits are famous for this, where they would almost deliberately confuse people. They confuse people by adding a racial element into what would have definitely been whites only, and they've put they put a black actress where they probably they shouldn't have been. There's nothing wrong with that. It's an artistic form.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally and it's lovely. I love it. I think it's brilliant.
Sure.
But is it important in the audio description sense?
Right. So, to me, the answer is in our final 10 minutes. To me, the answer is it depends on the context of what you're watching, right? It does depend. Sometimes you do need to say what the person looks like. Sometimes it is okay to say what they look like and what their complexion is or what color. So sometimes it is okay. It depends upon the context, and what it comes down to is how much would the sighted viewer view and value that same information is what it means to me. How important would that? Well, how important that is that to a sighted person, And then I think it's really, really interesting. Because any film that I love, and I love many films, but any film that stands out to me always has not necessarily audio description. Although when I was a little boy, I watched many films from DVS. But to make a long story short, anytime that I watch a film with natural narration, as in a film where it's not audio described, but there's still a narrator character that narrates the godlike, the third person, those films always stand out to me. And when that is done well, it completely shifts and completely changes the landscape of the experience when you just have one person sort of acting as the narrator, the god and the godlike narrator in a story. It really paints the picture. And some people who do that have absolutely beautiful voices. The other thing with audio description is you have to have just the right voice. I
Yeah.
do, as you know, I do some volunteer work as a voice actor. And I was talking to someone before I was reading a script just the other day, and I was saying, well, I really want you to choose me and, things like that. And he says, you don't have to ask me to choose you because your voice is the voice I want. It's a very tricky thing. If they want that voice, that's the voice they want. That's a very
Yeah,
tricky
yeah,
thing. So
yeah.
you gotta have just the right flavor to the voice. I typically obviously I have a deep and sort of gravelly voice. So I like audio describers who, sound like me, who have sort of a deep voice, but also a smooth voice. You also have to have, also to be a podcaster or to be an audio describer, you also have to have incredibly subtle and in-depth control of your breathing and when you breathe and when you pause. And that's just a skill that you have to build. It's very tricky. So yeah. So this Joel Snyder, of course I know of the person. So
Yeah.
how, you obviously know what I'm going to ask. How well do you know the guy?
I knew him well. I haven't come across him. I haven't spoken to him or written to him for a while. Sadly, I didn't, how one does, it lapsed. But I used
Sure.
to engage with him a lot because that's how I
Sure.
got those. He
I
sent
mean,
me,
absolutely. I
why,
mean,
what are you after?
do you think you could help me to get in touch with him? Because I think it would
Sure,
be an
sure.
incredible
Yeah.
accomplishment, an incredible conversation. I think I forget. I mean, I know I've known of the guy over the years. I forget if I've ever reached out to him. Certain people, I feel I just need a little bit more help. And when I see that you're willing to do all this for Aaron's opinion, I want you to be able to help us if you can, to provide us. And later
Yeah, yeah.
we'll catch
No,
up
I'm
on
pretty sure
WhatsApp
I
and
can.
talk about that. But any
Yeah.
any help you can get me to successfully put Aaron's opinion in touch with him, that would be really incredible
That would
stuff.
be a
All
great
right.
treat, actually.
So
I mean,
how would
he's,
you in
yeah.
next 5 to 6 minutes, how would you wrap up this whole beautiful discussion of simply audio description? Where do you want to, what's some
Okay.
information and knowledge you want the listener
I
to
think
leave with today?
my message is to sighted people who are obviously not necessarily listening entirely, but even to blind people is don't, well, remember what I said right in the beginning, the things we miss. And I've realized that we miss it. Let me tell you very quickly, I'll tell you in 1 minute,
Sure.
less than a minute. So that Sea Point promenade, and I told you about the rhinoceros sculpture that was so clever. Now, I didn't know that existed. It's been there for years, a decade. I didn't know. I didn't know. I'd walked past it for almost 100 times. And no one took the trouble. Even my wife, no one ever said, "Oh wow, what an amazing sculpture." And it was they mentioned it suddenly in another context. I said, What about it? Tell me about it." "Oh, you're kidding me," I said. So the sighted, even our loved ones, who are lovely with us in terms of describing things, either they grow fatigued or they literally forget. And so I would urge blind people to be curious. And when you hear the slightest thing that might interest you, don't walk past, interrogate. And so to sighted people, I would say, wake up, pay attention to what you're looking at, because it might very well interest your blind friend walking with you. And so don't skimp, don't be stingy with your sort of cornucopia of visual stimulus. Share it through audio. Tell us about what we might be missing.
I could not have asked for a better conclusion. I think that beautifully wraps up both topics today. Absolutely, I got to congratulate you for sticking with me and being willing to put forth as much kindness and effort as you do. You're the personality that I celebrate here at Aaron's Opinion. This is what I want on Aaron's Opinion. So I'm actually, I got to be overly direct with you and say, I didn't expect you to be willing to put up with this for nearly 2 hours, but I am forever grateful you did. I could not have
Thank you.
asked for a better guest, and I could not have asked for more knowledge. And I'd be curious to see what everybody else around the community says. But this is an absolute highlight here for us. And I just want to say that I wish you the very best of a wonderful, wonderful day in your hotel, doing everything else you need to do down there in South Africa, and um, we will certainly catch up on WhatsApp later on today.
Sure.
And please do send me that Joel Snyder recording that you
I
still
will.
have of that painting. And you can certainly WhatsApp that audio to me. We will certainly catch up later. I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to yours. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Now I
Great pleasure.
would like to wish you a wonderful day in South Africa. We'll catch up later. As we say
you.
here at Aaron's Opinion. See you later, everybody. Keep podcasting and be well. Take care. Help one person today. Help 1 million people tomorrow.
Well
All
done.
right. So for those
was
of
good.
you who have stuck with us on YouTube, thank you so much. Please comment below and ask all of your questions, and have a wonderful day. We will certainly be back soon. Take care, everybody. Help one
Bye-bye.
person today. Help 1 million people tomorrow. Be well over there. Take care. We'll see you soon over on WhatsApp. Take care.